Marjorie Tyrell had always possessed an elegant poise, a subtle aura of strength wrapped in sweet smiles and strategic grace. On the day the great September of Baelor was destroyed, that very aura had guided her instincts to sense something amiss. Her green eyes, bright as sun-dappled leaves, had flickered with suspicion as she stood amidst the hush of the faith's congregation, looking back toward the doors and the entrance corridor. She did not know precisely what was wrong, only that something was deeply out of place. Her life of court politics, trial by rumor, and battles of wits had sharpened her ability to detect the faintest tremor in the environment, like a cat catching the scent of smoke before the flame came. And so, with an inexplicable dread tightening her heart, she had whispered to her brother Loras to follow her, forcing their way out of the crowd. But a single motion from the faith militant blocked them. When the explosion of wildfire shook the September walls in an unholy roar, the only measure that saved her was her frantic scramble for an outer corridor. She was knocked off her feet by a fearsome blast of hot, viridescent flames. A few faith militant warriors burned instantly, turning to silhouettes against the blazing inferno. Confusion reigned. Smoke churned like a living beast, devouring stone and flesh alike. The glass windows exploded inwards, shards slicing through the air, lethal as arrows. Marjorie felt a fragment nick her arm, and the hot searing of her skin told her it was a shallow cut, though blood trickled down. She did not scream. There was no air in her lungs to scream with, and the horrifying impact stole all capacity for rational thought but that single primal command: survive. She crawled across scorched stone, her vision swimming with tears and swirling embers. At one moment, she felt hands grab at her shoulders, and she pushed them off, thinking them a faith militant still determined to hold her inside. But it was her brother Loras who clutched at her, half in agony, half in desperation. He had been battered by tumbling debris, the left side of his face singed, and though he tried to speak, only a weak groan emerged. Marjorie, ignoring the flames licking against her back, seized her brother's arm and dragged him onward, away from the heart of the destruction. The corridor started collapsing. Blocks of stone rained down, the structure of the building undone by wildfire's fury. She was not a warrior, but she was cunning and determined. She navigated the swirling chaos by wits and a sense of where the nearest exit lay. In those seconds, she understood that Cersei Lannister's plan had come to fruition. She had no proof, but all her instincts pointed to the Queen Mother's treacherous hand behind the greenish blaze. Could be no one else. Marjorie's heart thundered with anger, but panic was stronger, fueling her limbs until she found a half-shattered door that led out to a side stair. The majority of King's Landing had not yet realized what had happened. The explosion was still brand new, and the high, trembling wail from the city's folk was just beginning. Smoke poured down the corridor, the acrid sting of wildfire residue choking the air. Marjorie pushed her weight against the half-broken exit until she and Loras spilled out onto a crumbling stone landing. She coughed violently, her throat raw from heat and dust. The intense noise of more explosions hammered her hearing. She tumbled forward and found herself on a narrow ledge, feeling loose fragments of masonry slip beneath her. She risked a glance back. The grand dome of the September cracked under the might of that green inferno, and she watched in horror as the top caved inward, taking with it the faith militant, the High Sparrow, her father Mace, and so many others. The ground shook. She shielded Loras's body as best she could from flying debris. For one moment, the world around them was purely a chaotic tableau of screams, dust, and the roar of wildfire. When the aftershock passed, she realized her entire family, her father, her grandmother's hope, her brother's future. Everything might be gone or in tatters, but she didn't have time to confirm any of it. She had to flee. Forcing her brother's arm over her shoulders, Marjorie half-walked, half-lugged him down the precarious steps. Another explosion spat fire, but it seemed smaller, more an echo of the central blast. Her eyes stung with tears. She tasted soot on her tongue. At the bottom of the steps lay the charred remains of what had once been a religious square, now cracked and littered with rubble. She tried to keep her breathing steady, reminding herself that if she let grief and confusion rule her now, Both she and Loras would die. She had to keep her composure, for composure was a sword as sharp as steel in the Game of Thrones. They reached a safer stretch of street behind the September. Panicked crowds began swarming in the distance, crying out in alarm and horror. Cersei's vile victory would already be echoing around the city. Wildfire's unearthly glow had been visible in the sky, and the rumor mill would spread like the same flame. Margaery let Loras slide gently against a wall, and she bent over him. He was breathing shallowly, his face contorted in pain. He tried to say her name, and she squeezed his hand. It was warm, too warm, and she realized with dread that his wounds might have been worse than she could see. Half of his doublet was burned away, revealing angry red flesh on his chest and side. Frantically, she looked around. People were running in every direction, while some stood still, sobbing uncontrollably. At that moment, no one recognized Margaery Tyrell in her dust-stained finery. Her hair had come loose, and her face was blackened from smoke. She was simply a figure among the ruins. She could use that anonymity, but Loras was dying in front of her. She needed a maester or a healer, someone who could keep him breathing. The Tyrell pride in him still flickered, as though he refused to slip away without a final fight. To her left, a small alley led to an older section of King's Landing. She knew that district harbored a cramped scepter too, but the entire faith might be in disarray now, its leaders destroyed. She cursed under her breath, then resolved to act. She would find healing, whether from a black market apothecary or a hidden maester. She took Loras's arm and pulled it around her shoulder once more. She whispered words of encouragement, telling him to hold on, that she would save him, that the mother would guide their steps. But inside, she wondered if the gods were as helpless in the face of wildfire as any mortal. They stumbled through the alley, weaving among trash heaps and petrified small folk. Some recognized something regal in Margaery's bearing, but were too stunned to do anything but stare or scurry away. The fear of more explosions weighed heavily in the air, seeding every mind with panic. She at last spotted a sign scrawled with a mortar and pestle. It looked old, even half-burned from some past accident, but Margaery hoped it was still a functioning shop for remedies. She forced the door open with her hip, supporting Loras's half-conscious weight. A pungent scent of stale herbs and vinegar enveloped her. Inside, behind a cramped counter, a middle-aged woman with gray-streaked black hair and startled eyes exclaimed at the sight of them. Margaery, breathless, implored her for assistance. The woman, after a second's hesitation, nodded and motioned them to a back room. In the dim light, she helped lower Loras onto a small cot. She asked no names, but she must have recognized them. "You're from the big families," she stammered, fear clear in her voice. "Please," Margaery managed, fighting the tremor in her own voice. "He's badly burned. If you can do anything." The woman swallowed and took out jars of ointments, rags, and bandages. She did what she could, applying salves that made Loras hiss in pain, though his eyes stayed closed. The woman was no skilled maester, that much was clear, but she had the knowledge of a local herbalist. She recited half-muttered prayers under her breath, as though hoping the gods might intervene. Margaery stripped the remains of Loras's charred clothing. On his chest, the angry burns had begun blistering, but his breath, while weak, continued. She clutched his hand. As the herbalist worked, Margaery's mind raced in a whirlwind of political instincts. She had been scheduled for trial that day, to stand before the High Sparrow's justice. Cersei had cunningly chosen not to appear. Then the bells had begun tolling ominously. Now Margaery understood fully. Cersei had orchestrated the High Sparrow's doom, and had intended to kill Margaery, Loras, and all the Tyrell power in King's Landing in one fell burst of wildfire. It was monstrous, and it was brilliant. She felt rage simmer in her blood, making her heart pound and her limbs tremble. She closed her eyes, inhaled slowly, forcing calm. She would not die. Loras would not die. She would avenge them all. When the herbalist stepped back, her hands shaking slightly, she gave Margaery instructions to keep Loras as still as possible, to change the dressings each day. She offered a small bottle of something that might stave off infection. "I can't guarantee he'll survive, but if the 7 are merciful," the woman murmured, voice trailing off. Marjorie swallowed back tears. Her father was almost certainly dead, and her grandmother was in Highgarden, not aware of what had just happened. She had lost so much. She asked the herbalist if she knew of any safe place. The woman shook her head, plainly terrified. "I only know that men are scouring the city for survivors. The Crown's men, I suppose. They'll find you if you stay in King's Landing." Marjorie looked down at her beloved brother, half lost in delirium. He needed rest, yet staying here risked Cersei's men finding them. Or the masses might deliver them to the Crown, hoping for a reward. She felt the old cynicism returning. This city could devour them. She had to move. She had to save her brother, and she had to plan her vengeance. The greatest advantage she had now was that Cersei likely believed her dead. If Marjorie could keep her survival secret for as long as possible, she might formulate a strategy to strike back. She asked the herbalist if there was any quiet, hidden place they might hide until Loras could travel. The woman hesitated, wringing her hands, then spoke of a small, abandoned stable near the city's northern walls. People seldom went there now, and it was rumored to be haunted after the War of the Five Kings. Fearful peasants avoided it. Marjorie accepted the directions with gratitude and pressed a gold ring into the woman's hand. The ring bore the sigil of House Tyrell. It was recognizable, but the herbalist would likely sell it quickly for coin, not daring to speak of who gave it to her. Night had almost fallen by the time Marjorie helped Loras back onto his feet. By then, the city was in full uproar. People poured from the outer squares to gather near the Red Keep's vantage points, all wanting to see the smoking ruin of the Great September. The king, Tommen Baratheon, was rumored to have done something desperate. Some said he had taken his own life, casting himself from a window. Others said he was hidden away. The city thrummed with tension. Marjorie felt a pang of sorrow at the thought of the young king. He had loved her in his way, and she had cherished him in a gentle, sisterly manner. She could not protect him in the end. But if Tommen was dead, that meant Cersei was free to claim the throne by right of the last living Lannister line. The possibility fueled Marjorie's resolve. She refused to let that wicked queen triumph without a fight. Navigating the back streets by torchlight, she guided Loras carefully, stopping often to rest. He wavered in and out of consciousness, sometimes moaning her name, sometimes delirious from the pain. She coaxed water into his mouth. The stable, when she found it, was indeed run down, with half the roof collapsed. It smelled of dust, rats, and rotten straw. No one greeted them, though she saw faint footprints in the dirt, perhaps vagrants seeking shelter. They found a corner that offered partial cover from the elements, and she propped Loras against a splintered stall door. She was exhausted, physically and mentally. Darkness pressed around them. She collapsed at his side, letting her head rest on the old wood, though her mind would not stop racing. The next day, the city was abuzz with the ascension of Queen Cersei Lannister, first of her name, crowned in the Red Keep's throne room with little pomp and a great deal of fear. Marjorie listened to the rumors and news from passers-by in the alley. She kept to the stable mostly, venturing out only to search for water and meager food with the last coins she had hidden in her dress. She took care not to be recognized. Her hair was matted, her dress torn and black with soot. It was a blessing that her own face was partially cut and bruised. She moved like a specter through the city, unrecognized by all. Inside, though, she was Marjorie Tyrell, daughter of Mace Tyrell, granddaughter of Olenna Redwine, rightful queen consort of the Seven Kingdoms to Tommen Baratheon. And now, in spirit, a woman scorned and nearly murdered by Cersei's ambition. She vowed she would not remain a powerless fugitive for long. She had to gather allies. House Tyrell might be in disarray, but the name still carried weight, especially in the Reach. If she could escape the city with Loras, gather the banners in Highgarden, she might challenge Cersei's rule. But first, Loras needed to heal, and she could not move him too far until he was well enough to ride. At night, she would gently tend his bandages, cleaning the burns as best she could. He'd grown feverish, drifting in and out of awareness. She whispered stories from their childhood, reminded him of bright fields of roses in Highgarden, of the orchard blossoms and the sweet wind that blew in from the mander. She told him he had to live, that she needed him. He would sometimes look at her with confusion, perhaps not even recognizing her, but she found flickers of the old Loras in his eyes. She believed in him, no matter that the city was ablaze with fresh violence. Looters pillaged homes abandoned by the unfortunate, the faith militant who survived were hunted, and Lannister guards seized control of the districts in a stern clampdown. Margaery held fast to her faith that they would survive. On the 5th day, he was strong enough to walk with help, though the slightest movement caused him terrible pain. She timed their move after dusk, slipping through side alleys, avoiding main thoroughfares where the Crown's men patrolled. They made painstaking progress toward the Gate of the Gods, which opened onto the King's Road that led southwest to the Reach. But as they approached, they saw the heavy presence of guards. The city was locked down tighter than before, with Cersei evidently fearful of any Tyrell supporters or faith insurgents escaping. The Gold Cloaks were suspicious of anyone leaving the city, searching for hidden lords and ladies. Margaery felt her stomach turn cold at the thought of being discovered. She guided Loras away before the guards could see him. She realized with a sinking heart that the direct route home was cut off. The new queen would not allow easy egress for anyone who might challenge her authority. For days, Margaery scouted the walls, trying to find a weak point or a bribable guard. But Cersei's clampdown was effective. In that time, Margaery had to ration their dwindling supplies, scrounge for scraps, and rely on Loras's faltering strength not to fail. She found herself cursing her own lack of resources. Once, she had commanded the might of House Tyrell in King's Landing. She had worn the finest gowns and dined on delicacies. Now, she had only a blade she had salvaged off a dead man's belt and a few coins filched from a moneylender's stall in a moment of desperation. Each night, she prayed to the Seven for a chance to prove her worth and to strike back at the woman who had done this to her family. At last, fortune shifted slightly in Margaery's favor. She encountered, in a deserted stretch of slum near the Mud Gate, a pair of men in battered armor who were clearly not Gold Cloaks, nor were they simply small folk. They whispered among themselves as they stood watch near a half-collapsed hovel. Intrigued, Margaery lingered in the shadows to observe. The men had a certain bearing, as though they belonged to a minor house from the Riverlands or the Crownlands, but she could not be certain. They had swords, and though their armor was old, it bore sigils that had been scratched off or covered. She thought them possible deserters from the war or mercenaries. She was about to move away when one of them spotted her. His sudden alertness made her freeze. They called out, demanding to know what she was doing. She approached with caution, adjusting her tattered cloak to hide Loras behind her. Her heart pounded, but she recognized an opportunity if these men had some reason to oppose Cersei. Summoning her natural charm, albeit in a bedraggled state, she said she was seeking a way out of the city. She told them that she and her wounded brother needed to reach the Reach for medical treatment. She offered them coin if they could smuggle her out. She had only a few copper dragons left, so it was not a real bribe, but she hoped her persuasive manner might stir their interest. The men looked at each other warily, and Margaery realized they had recognized her voice or her face beneath the soot. Their eyes widened. They were no loyal Cersei men. One of them whispered, "Gods, it's the Tyrell girl, the one who was to be queen." At that, Margaery stiffened, fear coursing through her. But the second man seemed not hostile, but rather awed. "We heard you were killed in the explosion." Margaery composed herself, meeting their gaze directly. "I was meant to die, but I live. If you're enemies of Cersei, then help me get out of this city. If I survive, House Tyrell will not forget its friends." They exchanged glances again. Finally, the older of the two stepped forward. He introduced himself in a low voice as Ser Devron Hightower, a distant cousin of the main Hightower line. He had fought for the Tyrells during the War of the Five Kings, left the battlefield to recover from wounds, and found himself stranded in King's Landing when Margaery's father had forcibly left him behind. apparently forgetting him in the chaos. Now, with the city in lockdown, he and his companion Lanton, a sworn sword from a lesser branch of House Beesbury, were seeking a means of escape themselves. Devron had not known Marjorie personally, but recognized her as the Tyrell Rose who had married the young king. He had guessed her to be dead. Yet here she was, in rags, with a wounded man behind her. Marjorie lowered her hood, revealing her face. She looked directly into Devron's eyes. "I beg your help," she said. "My house has been gravely wronged. My father is likely dead. My grandmother is alone in Highgarden. My brother Loras is dying. If you are still loyal to your oath to the Tyrells, then stand by me now. Help me get him to safety. In return, I swear, by the father and the mother, you will be richly rewarded, and House Hightower's place will be assured if I can reclaim what Cersei stole from me." Devron's face twisted with conflict, but at last he nodded. "My lady, or should I say, your grace, I cannot say no to a chance to strike back at the Lannisters. But you must know that the way out of the city is dangerous and closely watched." Marjorie's chin lifted slightly. At his shift from "my lady" to "your grace," she felt a mixture of relief and pride. Though exhausted and filthy, she was still every inch a queen in her mind. "Tell me how," she said, "and we will find a way." They led her into the collapsed hovel, which disguised a hidden tunnel entrance beneath a half-broken floorboard. Once, it had been used by black market smugglers to bring in illicit goods from the river. It led beneath a labyrinth of sewers, eventually emerging near the banks outside the walls. Devron and Lanton had discovered it while searching for secret routes. The problem was that the city's rats and filth made it dangerous, as well as the possibility of encountering crown soldiers who might also know of these tunnels. Marjorie listened, determined. She insisted they attempt the passage that very night. Loras would not last much longer without better care. Before they departed, Devron and Lanton fetched a small store of provisions, dried meat, water, and some cloth. They even found a battered cloak for Loras, who could barely stand. Marjorie helped him along as they descended into the reeking darkness of the old tunnel. The stench was overwhelming, causing her stomach to lurch. Loras grunted in pain with each step. The flickering torchlight cast eerie shadows on the dripping walls. They wove through winding channels, occasionally hearing scuttling rats. Twice, they paused at ominous sounds, a clank of steel or a faint echo of voices. Each time, they hid in a niche until silence returned. Devron led the way using an old smuggler's map. Marjorie's heart hammered, torn between the horror of these cramped tunnels and the hope that freedom lay at the far end. She clutched Loras's arm, whispering encouragement, though she felt he was nearly at the limit of his endurance. At last, after what felt like hours, the tunnel began to slope upward. The smell of rotting algae replaced the putrid stench of sewage. Devron signaled for silence. Ahead, moonlight filtered through a broken grate. Lanton stepped forward, carefully prying it loose with a small crowbar. They eased it aside. The air outside smelled of night and brackish river water. One by one, they slipped through, mindful to keep quiet. Marjorie and Loras emerged onto a small patch of muddy ground near the Blackwater Rush. The city walls rose behind them. The river spread out in dark ripples, reflecting the moonlight. They were outside King's Landing. Relief rushed through Marjorie, nearly buckling her knees. She clung to Loras, though he swayed with fatigue. In the distance, she heard the faint clamor of the city. Shouts of guards on patrol, the general unrest that came with Cersei's ascension. They had escaped. Devron murmured that they should move further from the walls lest they be spotted by searchlights or archers. Carefully, they made their way along the riverbank, keeping low. Eventually, they found a small cluster of trees where they could hide until dawn. Marjorie lowered Loras to the ground, resting his head on her lap. She brushed sweat-drenched hair from his brow. He was feverish and exhausted, but his eyes fluttered open, meeting hers for a fleeting moment. She smiled softly, tears threatening. He whispered something she couldn't quite hear, but she squeezed his hand. They dared not light a fire, so Devron and Lanton took turns keeping watch. Marjorie sat awake, cradling Loras in the chill night air, her mind drifting to the future. She was free of the city, but she was far from safe. The Crown would hunt her if they discovered she was alive. She had to reach Highgarden, rally what remained of the Tyrell forces, and secure allies. But who would stand with her? The houses of the Reach had lost confidence in the Tyrells after Mace had marched so eagerly to support the Lannisters in the war. Perhaps the Tarleys, but Randall Tarley was a proud man, quick to shift allegiances if it benefited him. The Hightowers might be her best bet, assuming Devron could help. And then there was her grandmother, Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, who would undoubtedly be plotting a response of her own once she learned of this atrocity. That would be Margaery's best hope, if Olenna still had the will to strike at the Lannisters. Dawn came in a pale wash of gray light, revealing a new day that smelled of dew and the faint tang of salt from the sea beyond. Loras slept fitfully. Devron quietly suggested they search for horses or a carriage. Traveling on foot all the way to Highgarden with an injured man would be grueling and dangerous. Lanton nodded in agreement. Margaery, having no better plan, agreed. While Loras dozed, Margaery combed her fingers through the tangles of her hair, as if it might help restore some sense of dignity. She realized she was now a fugitive queen, disheveled and in pain. Yet she also felt a grim determination. They set off away from the city, keeping to small roads where peasants traveled. Sometimes they passed fields that had been left fallow or destroyed by the wars. The devastation from years of conflict was evident everywhere. Burnt farmsteads, broken wagons, shallow graves. The common folk regarded them warily, but Margaery's group kept their heads down. They purchased a donkey at an exorbitant price from a frightened farmer, paying with a silver brooch Devron still had. Loras was too weak to sit a horse, but he could manage the donkey if they moved slowly. For days, they trudged onward along back routes leading into the Reach, ever mindful of watch patrols or roving bandits. Over that time, Loras's fever abated somewhat, and color returned to his cheeks. Occasionally, Margaery would catch him looking around in confusion, as though still unsure how they had escaped. She would smile, squeeze his hand, and reassure him that they were safe, for now. One evening, they paused near the border between the Crownlands and the northern edge of the Reach. Devron explained that once they crossed that line, they might find more sympathetic folk. They had set up a small camp in a hollow by a stream, the donkey tethered nearby. Loras rested against a tree, while Margaery paced restlessly. She had not had a moment of true privacy since leaving the city, and her mind churned with the enormity of her situation. Eventually, Devron approached, bowing slightly in a show of respect. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "we are close to your family's lands, but we should decide on our path. If you go directly to Highgarden, it might be dangerous. If Cersei has anticipated your survival, she might have stationed watchers on the main roads leading to the Tyrell seat. Perhaps we should find your grandmother first. She may be at Highgarden, or she may have gone to Dorne, or somewhere else entirely, forging alliances. Do you know how to find her?" Margaery shook her head. "I do not, but I suspect she might be at Highgarden, gathering what remains of our forces or preparing to negotiate an alliance. My grandmother will want revenge for what happened." She paused, her gaze falling on Loras. "I must see him cared for properly. A maester, proper bandages, a bed to rest in. We can't roam indefinitely." Devron placed a hand over his heart. "I will do whatever you command. We can try to disguise ourselves as small folk on the main roads, or attempt to skirt the outlying farmland to avoid detection." Margaery gave a decisive nod. "We will travel in secret as much as possible, and if we must, we present ourselves to those who remember their loyalty to House Tyrell." The next day they pressed on. Loras, though still far from full strength, grew more alert, asking Margaery about their plans, about the city, about the explosion. Sometimes, she would see tears well in his eyes when he spoke of their father, or the knights of the Reach who likely perished. But he would blink them away, forging a shell of stoic resolve. He had lost everything: his position as a famed knight, his handsome features marred by scars. But Marjorie saw in him the same strong spirit. He would not break. She would not let him. As they ventured deeper into the reach, the land grew gentler, dotted with rolling hills, golden fields, and vineyards. They traveled mostly by night, sleeping in barns or under hedgerows, paying or begging for scraps of bread along the way. Farmers were more likely to give them charity here, for House Tyrell had long been generous overlords. Marjorie found a quiet pride in that. Her father might have been pompous, but the small folk remembered that the Tyrells usually cared for their people's welfare. At last, after nearly 2 weeks on the road, they were within a day's ride of Highgarden. It was late afternoon, sunlight slanting warm and gold over the fields. Marjorie gazed at the distant castle's silhouette with a surge of emotion. She remembered childhood days running through those gardens, the heady scent of roses, the laughter of courtiers on the grassy terraces. Felt like another lifetime. She dismounted the donkey and turned to Devron. "Stay with Loras," she instructed, "and keep him hidden near that copse of trees. I will ride ahead with Lantern to see what the situation is at the gates." Devron nodded, though worry flickered in his eyes. "Be careful." Marjorie took a deep breath. Then she and Lantern proceeded along the main road that wound through farmland toward Highgarden's walls. She noted that the usual hustle and bustle of peddlers, travelers, and guards was noticeably subdued. Where were the caravans bringing fruits and grain to the castle? Why were there so few guards at the outer watchtowers? The place seemed too quiet. As they neared, they saw a small group of men in House Tyrell livery stationed at a checkpoint. Marjorie's heart leapt. These were her family's men, but she forced herself to remain cautious. She guided the donkey forward, Lantern trailing on foot. One guard, wearing the rose sigil on his cloak, raised a hand to stop them. His face was weary, etched with the lines of worry. "State your business," he said dully. Marjorie lifted her hood, revealing her face. "I am Marjorie Tyrell," she said in a clear voice. "I demand entry to Highgarden." The guard's eyes widened, shock giving way to something like awe and relief. Immediately he fell to his knee, and the others followed suit. "My lady, my queen, I thought you dead." The rumor was the entire family in King's Landing. He trailed off, looking uncertain whether to address her as Lady or Your Grace. "News of my demise was premature," Marjorie responded with a trace of wryness. "I need to see my grandmother, the Lady Olenna. Is she within?" The guard looked stricken. The Lady Olenna left Highgarden shortly after word came of the September's destruction. She was in a rage, Your Grace. She said she had business in Dorne. She took a small retinue, left the castle to be managed by her steward. Marjorie's heart clenched. So her grandmother had indeed sought out new alliances. That likely meant seeking an accord with Ilaria Sand, who now ruled Dorne in Prince Doran Martell's stead. After the recent events in Sunspear, Ilaria had reasons to hate the Lannisters as well. Perhaps Lady Olenna wanted to coordinate vengeance. Marjorie could almost hear her grandmother's sharp tongue, spitting venom at the Lannisters. She nodded, containing her reaction. "Then I must speak with the steward at once. My brother Loras is with me as well, though injured." The guards exchanged looks of concern and pity. "We will send word to the steward to prepare for your arrival." "Welcome home, my lady," said the guard and stood aside. They made haste back to retrieve Loras and Devron, bringing them to the gate. The guards recognized Devron's name and admitted him readily. Marjorie sat on the donkey beside her brother, cradling him, while the men parted before them. A throng of castle servants and retainers quickly gathered, their murmurs and exclamations rippling through the courtyard as Marjorie Tyrell, once declared dead, rode in, her brother half-draped across the donkey, both bearing signs of the horrors they had endured. Soot still stained her cloak, and Loras's face bore burned scars. Some wept openly, others knelt. The steward, a gaunt man named Collingford, rushed out, bowing. He directed stable hands to help carry Loras inside. Marjorie dismounted wearily, though she kept her head high, her posture regal. "My brother needs immediate care from the maester," she commanded, and I will require fresh clothing and a place to speak with you privately. Summon anyone still loyal to House Tyrell who holds authority here." Carlingford bowed again, ushering them into the castle. Marjorie felt a wave of nostalgia mix with sorrow as they passed through the familiar halls. The paintings on the walls, the high windows letting in the golden afternoon light, the trailing vines of roses climbing the stone. This was home, yet it was a place changed by tragedy. The castle seemed subdued, as if the bright spirit of House Tyrell had been dimmed by the news of the king's death and the probable destruction of the family in King's Landing. Maester Yakin, a stout, gray-bearded man, examined Loras in a comfortable chamber. The bed was large with fresh linens. Marjorie hovered anxiously as Yakin carefully peeled away Loras's bandages and applied ointments that smelled pungent but promised to help with scarring and prevent infection. Loras groaned, but he bore it stoically. When the maester was done, he turned to Marjorie. "He will live, but he needs time and rest and careful tending of these burns. I'll do my best to minimize the scarring, but some wounds cannot be undone entirely. He'll likely never wield a sword as he once did, my lady." Marjorie nodded, her eyes misting slightly. She knew how dearly Loras valued his prowess. Still, the important thing was that he lived. She sat by the bed, brushing his hair back softly. He mumbled something about their father, about the Great September. She hushed him, promising him that he was safe. After a while, when he fell into a much-needed sleep, she rose, squared her shoulders, and went to see Carlingford and the handful of knights and castellans who remained at Highgarden. They met in a modest solar overlooking the rose gardens. Carlingford introduced the assembled men. A few had been older knights, left to guard the castle in Mace Tyrell's absence. Some were stewards in charge of finances or masters of horse. All looked relieved and somewhat astonished to see Marjorie. She took a seat at the head of the table, refusing to stand on ceremony but making it clear she was in command. Devron and Lanton stood near the wall, serving as her informal guards. Marjorie let them talk first, listening carefully to glean what they knew of recent events. They confirmed that Lady Olenna had departed for Dorne, presumably to speak with the Sand Snakes. Some outriders had come from the crown, bearing notice that Cersei Lannister was queen and that House Tyrell must bend the knee and recognize her sovereignty. Carlingford, uncertain and unsettled by the tragedy, had delayed any formal reply, awaiting Lady Olenna's return or further instructions. The crown's men had not yet arrived in person, presumably busy solidifying power in the Crownlands. The knights and castellans seemed anxious, uncertain if they should muster forces or comply. Then Marjorie spoke, her voice level but resonating with quiet intensity. She recounted, without detail of her harrowing flight, how Cersei had planned the explosion of the Great September, murdering countless innocents, including Mace Tyrell and the High Sparrow. She told them of her near death and her brother's grievous wounds. She did not mince words, stating that House Tyrell could never yield to such a monstrous tyrant. Her father had died for the crown's cause, only to be betrayed in the end. The men around the table paled with fury and horror. She implored them to stand with her, to reject Cersei's rule, and to prepare their levies should war come. She did not promise an easy path, only that House Tyrell's honor demanded revenge. Some gave immediate assent, pounding their fists on the table or swearing oaths to the rose. Others were more tentative, pointing out that they had no direct alliances secured. Lord Randall Tarly was a formidable commander in the Reach, and his allegiance was in question. If Tarly sided with Cersei, it would pose a serious threat to Highgarden's forces. Marjorie nodded gravely, acknowledging the risk. "I will not wait meekly for my grandmother's return," Marjorie said, her eyes sweeping over the men. "Nor will I bow to Cersei as she sits on a throne built on the ashes of my family. You all served my father. Serve me now, and I will lead House Tyrell in defiance of that cruel woman. If you wish to desert, you may go, but know that if you stay, your loyalty must be absolute." One by one, the men declared themselves. Most pledged to remain with her. A few shifted uneasily, but none openly defected, at least not in that meeting. With that settled, Marjorie instructed them to begin quietly gathering men, reaching out to lesser lords and sworn houses who might still be loyal to the Tyrell cause. They would do so discreetly to avoid alerting Cersei's watchers. Meanwhile, she would write to her grandmother in Dorne, hoping to coordinate a united front. In private that night, Marjorie sat at a small desk in her old bedchamber, quill in hand, composing letters to Olenna, to several lesser lords, to the Hightowers of Old Town, to whomever might be swayed to her cause. Each letter had to be carefully worded, not only to convey her survival, but to persuade them that she could lead House Tyrell in these troubled times. She would remind them of the Lannisters' treachery, the burning of the Great September, the murder of Mace Tyrell. She would offer alliance, protection, the promise of a stable reach under her rule if they joined her in opposing Cersei. She also considered the possibility of forging alliances beyond Dorne. The North was in turmoil, with rumors that the bastards of Winterfell were waging war. The Vale might still be under Littlefinger's sway, but perhaps Peter Baelish would see advantage in supporting her if he believed he could profit. The Stormlands were largely in disarray, lacking a clear lord since Renly Baratheon's death. Marjorie sighed, her hand aching from writing. The Seven Kingdoms were fractured, and she was but one queen among many. Yet she had a rightful claim, or so she believed, as Tommen's widow. If Cersei could crown herself, why could not Marjorie, who had at least been crowned queen consort? But the throne was less important to her than vengeance. She wanted justice for her father, for her brothers' burns, for the thousands killed in that green flame. Yet if that meant taking the Iron Throne from Cersei, then so be it. She closed her eyes, letting the quill rest. Her mind drifted to Tommen. Poor, sweet Tommen, manipulated by all sides. She wondered if he had truly hurled himself from a window when he learned of the September's destruction, or if Cersei had arranged his death in another vile scheme. The thought filled her with sadness. She banished it for now. There was no time to mourn. As the weeks passed, Marjorie quietly consolidated power at Highgarden. She dispatched trusted riders to meet with local lords. In many cases, her name alone was enough to gather support. The small folk loved her for her kindness when she'd visited them in the past, handing out bread or showing interest in their plight. House Tyrell's bannermen mostly considered her a symbol of continuity, especially with Mace and Loras gone or out of commission. Some were cautious, fearful of facing the Lannisters, but Marjorie cultivated them with soft promises and veiled threats of retribution. If they refused. Little by little, a small force began to gather. Meanwhile, she oversaw Loras's healing progress. Each morning, she would visit him, bringing fresh flowers or a new book to read. Though he tried to hide it, she saw the sorrow in his eyes at the mention of knights or tournaments. The Maester's salves were working, but he would always bear the marks of wildfire. His left arm was stiff, and his once beautiful face was scarred along the cheek and temple. She assured him that none of that diminished his worth. "You are still the Knight of the Flowers," she whispered gently. "But more than that, you are my brother, and I need you by my side." He attempted to stand one day, wincing at the pain. "I will do what I must," he said through gritted teeth. She saw in him a determination that echoed her own. She helped him walk around the courtyard, ignoring the curious stares of servants. He was unsteady, but he improved daily. By the time a month had passed, he could climb the steps slowly, and even lift a sword for short periods, though it was more symbolic than practical. The men who had once admired him for his martial prowess now regarded him with a mixture of pity and reverence, as if he'd survived some legendary trial by fire. Letters began returning from some of the lesser lords, pledging fealty, though warily. There was a sense of momentum. Highgarden's larders were still ample, and the fortress was formidable. If Cersei wanted to press them, she would face a difficult siege, especially if Dorne joined in. But Marjorie was not content to wait passively for her grandmother's return. She felt that time was against her. Cersei was likely maneuvering in King's Landing to crush any perceived rebellion. Already, rumors told of Euron Greyjoy's alliance with Cersei, of an Iron Fleet patrolling the seas. Marjorie was no military strategist, but she studied the maps, listened to Devron's counsel, and made calculations. Highgarden's steward Collingford reported that traveling merchants brought news of Lannister troops moving through the Crownlands, possibly heading south. Marjorie felt her pulse quicken. Cersei was not wasting time. If she was determined to quell House Tyrell's rise, she would dispatch a host. And what about Randyll Tarly? He had not declared for Highgarden yet. He was rumored to be meeting with the Crown's envoys. Marjorie felt the old bitterness rise. Lord Tarly had never admired Mace Tyrell. If Cersei offered him a better deal, he might side with her. That could tilt the balance of power. One morning, as Marjorie supervised a training session in the courtyard, her newly assembled recruits drilling under the direction of Devron, she received word that a rider had arrived from Hornhill bearing a message. She excused herself and went to the great hall, where a young squire in Tarly colors waited nervously. The lad bowed deeply. "My lady, or rather your grace," he said, stammering. "I bear a letter from Lord Tarly." Marjorie took the sealed parchment, dismissing the squire. She broke the seal, scanning the words with mounting tension. Lord Tarly's message was short and formal. He acknowledged the rightful claim of House Tyrell as overlords of the Reach, but expressed grave concern about defying the crown. He demanded a conference with Marjorie, proposing a meeting on neutral ground to discuss how best to preserve the Reach from further devastation. She read between the lines. Tarly was not fully aligning with Cersei yet, but he had not declared open support for Marjorie either. A meeting could be a trap or a genuine negotiation. She weighed the risks. If Tarly joined Cersei, the combined strength of Tarly's forces and any Lannister host would threaten Highgarden. But if Marjorie could sway him, the rest of the Reach would likely fall in line, giving her a formidable army. At supper that evening, she gathered her closest advisors: Collingford, Devron, Lanton, and a few of the loyal knights. Loras was present too, wearing a loose tunic that covered most of his scars. They debated whether to accept Tarly's invitation. Collingford urged caution, suspecting a trap. Devron argued that Tarly was an honorable man who might abide by the rules of parley, though he was stubborn and proud. Loras, in a subdued voice, said that Tarly had once respected skilled warriors, but Mace Tyrell's vanity had always grated on him. Perhaps Marjorie's intelligence and leadership might earn his regard. Marjorie listened carefully to all viewpoints. At last she spoke. "We cannot simply hide here and hope Cersei's armies do not come. We need Tarly's support if we are to stand a chance. I will meet him under the banner of truce, but we will take precautions." She looked at Loras. "You will come with me if you are able." He might be swayed by the presence of the last living son of Mace Tyrell. "And you, Devron, will command the knights who accompany us for protection." Devron bowed. "As you wish, your grace." They planned the meeting for a clearing near the Mander, halfway between Highgarden and Hornhill. Tarly insisted on each side bringing no more than 20 men, armed only for personal defense. Marjorie agreed, though she made sure her best archers hid out of sight in the surrounding area in case Tarly tried any trick. She would take no chances. Her advisors helped her prepare. She wore a gown in the green and gold colors of House Tyrell, her hair styled in a modest yet regal fashion, and she donned a half-cloak embroidered with golden roses. She wanted to appear every inch the queenly figure, but not ostentatious. When the day arrived, Marjorie rode out with Loras at her side. He wore armor, lighter than his old plate, but enough to convey he was a knight of standing. His face was partially concealed by a helm, both to mask his scars and project a stronger visage. Devron and the knights followed behind, bearing House Tyrell's banner. The ride took them through lush fields near the Mander, reminding Marjorie of her childhood rides through the countryside. She steeled herself against nostalgia. The future was all that mattered now. They arrived at the appointed clearing. Lord Randyll Tarly was already there with his men, each wearing the huntsman badge of House Tarly. He was a tall, stern figure with graying hair and a perpetual scowl. Beside him stood his son Dickon, younger and broader, with a proud stance. Their men eyed the Tyrell party warily. Marjorie noted the presence of a few crossbowmen stationed at a distance. She nodded to Devron, who signaled that their own archers were in position. Lord Tarly approached. Marjorie dismounted gracefully. Loras, with some difficulty, followed. Tarly's gaze flicked to him, noting the scars. A flicker of something sympathy crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant. "My lord," Marjorie greeted, inclining her head. She did not kneel, for she recognized no higher authority here. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Tarly inclined his head stiffly. "My lady, many in the Reach believed you dead. It seems we were misinformed." Marjorie offered a thin smile. Cersei Lannister tried to erase House Tyrell. She failed. She gestured to Loras. "My brother and I live. We intend to defend our land against any who would usurp it." Dickon Tarly's eyes flicked between them, curiosity mingling with caution. Randall Tarly spoke, his tone measured. "I have heard the rumors of the Great September's destruction. A terrible crime, if true. But I have also heard that the Crown denies any responsibility, claiming it was the Faith militants' wildfire that misfired." Marjorie's lips tightened. "A lie. Cersei orchestrated it to rid herself of her enemies, my father included. She crowned herself queen afterward. Tell me, my lord, do you truly believe she is blameless?" Tarly gave no immediate answer, his jaw flexing. "I am no friend to the Faith militant, nor do I condone murder. But I also know that open rebellion against the crown is perilous. I have a duty to the people of the Reach to avoid needless bloodshed." Marjorie took a slow breath, carefully choosing her words. "Cersei is not the rightful heir. Tommen was king, but he is gone. By rights, the throne should pass to someone of Baratheon blood, or Targaryen blood if there are any left. Cersei Lannister has seized power by force. She unleashed wildfire on the city. She has declared herself queen through fear. If we bow to her, we become accomplices to her tyranny." There was a tense silence. Tarly looked at Loras, as if expecting him to speak. Loras lifted the visor of his helm, revealing the scarred side of his face, and Tarly's eyes flicked over it. "My father died a coward's death in that explosion," Loras said quietly, though his voice carried a razor's edge of anger. "He deserved better. House Tyrell was loyal to the crown, and we were betrayed. Cersei means to destroy our house, my lord. If she triumphs, Horn Hill will likely be next, for she trusts no one from the Reach." Tarly's expression hardened, though it was not directed at Loras, more at the situation. "You would have me fight a war against the crown, risking the lives of thousands in the Reach? Without the full support of the Seven Kingdoms, we would be outnumbered." Marjorie let a moment pass, letting Tarly's question linger in the air. Then she said, "My grandmother has gone to Dorne to forge an alliance. The Martells have their own reasons to despise the Lannisters. Together, we can field a formidable force. We also have the resources of Highgarden and the breadbasket of the Reach. If Lord Tarly lends his sword, others will follow. The Tyrell banners will unite, and when my grandmother returns with Dornish support, we will be strong enough to stand against Cersei. And what of the Targaryen queen rumored to be sailing for Westeros with dragons?" Tarly asked bluntly. "If Daenerys Targaryen lands in the Seven Kingdoms, will your war not draw her attention? Are we to fight on two fronts?" Marjorie answered calmly. "Daenerys Targaryen's intentions are her own, but she has reasons to hate the Lannisters as well. There is every chance she would welcome an alliance. I do not propose a rash, blind war, Lord Tarly. Only that we must not bend the knee to a woman who murders her own people with wildfire. Join me in standing for the Reach, for a future free of Lannister tyranny." Silence. A breeze rustled the tall grass by the riverside. Tarly's men shifted on their feet, uncertain. Dickon swallowed, looking between his father and Marjorie. Loras's breathing was slightly labored from the effort of standing upright in armor, but he held Tarly's gaze. At length, Lord Tarly drew himself up, face grim. "I have served House Tyrell for decades, though I have not always agreed with Mace Tyrell's choices. Yet I cannot deny the reach of your claim or the threat that Cersei poses. If she is indeed behind the September's destruction, she is no true queen. I will not stand idly by while she tears the Reach apart. He paused, exhaling. But my support does not come freely, my lady. I will require assurances that Horn Hill remains secure, that you rule the Reach wisely, that you do not cede authority to the Martells or the Targaryens without consideration of our people's welfare. Marjorie inclined her head. You shall have those assurances, Lord Tarly. The welfare of the Reach is my highest concern. We will sign a pact if you wish. He gave a curt nod. Then you have my sword and my men, provided you maintain a just cause. Betray me, and you will have an enemy more implacable than any Lannister. Marjorie allowed a small, relieved smile. She stepped forward, extending her hand. Tarly hesitated, then clasped it in a firm grip. She felt the tension of a new alliance forging in that moment. With Randall Tarly's armies behind her, the balance of power in the Reach tipped solidly in House Tyrell's favor. Cersei would no longer consider them a minor threat. This was the first step on the path to open conflict. They exchanged formal words of agreement, and Tarly proposed that she and Loras stay as guests at Horn Hill for a few days while final details were ironed out. Marjorie politely declined, insisting that she must return to Highgarden to continue preparations. They agreed that Tarly's troops would mobilize under House Tyrell's banner, and that a date and location would be chosen for a muster should Cersei's forces approach. With that, the meeting concluded. That evening, Marjorie, Loras, and their party returned to Highgarden in a quieter mood. The initial triumph of securing Tarly's allegiance was tempered by the realization that war was now inevitable. Marjorie felt a tightness in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and dread. She might soon lead the Reach's armies into battle, something she had never imagined doing when she was a mere maiden betrothed to kings and princes. But the times had changed her. She thought of Cersei's cruel smile, the green flames devouring the September. She hardened her heart. In the following days, messages flew to and from Horn Hill, detailing how many men Tarly would bring, how supplies would be stockpiled. Word spread among the smaller houses, many of whom declared for Marjorie without hesitation once they heard Tarly was on board. Devron estimated that within a few weeks, they could field a sizable host, though not yet on the scale of the combined Lannister armies. Marjorie heard no word from Olenna, which worried her, but she clung to the hope that her grandmother was forging an alliance in Dorne. Amid these preparations, Marjorie established a new routine. Each morning, she spent an hour with Loras, encouraging him to regain strength. Each afternoon, she sat in council, discussing war strategy with Devron, Collingford, and the Knights. She gave judgments on local disputes, ensuring the small folk saw her as a fair ruler in her father's stead. Each night, she lit a candle in the sept for Mace Tyrell, asking the Seven to guide her steps. She felt that same subtle steel in her soul that had saved her in the September. She was determined not to falter. Finally, nearly 3 weeks after her meeting with Tarly, Marjorie's grandmother returned. Word reached Highgarden that a small party bearing the Golden Rose and the Sun and Spear of Dorne approached the gates. Marjorie hurried to the courtyard, Loras trailing behind as swiftly as he could. There she saw Olenna Tyrell, clad in her usual headdress, perched on a horse with an imperious air. Beside her were several Dornish figures, among them Ilaria Sand, wearing the deep red and gold of Dorne, and Tyene Sand at her side. The moment Olenna dismounted, Marjorie rushed forward, tears brimming. Olenna's face softened, and she let her granddaughter embrace her. "My sweet girl," she whispered, "I heard you were lost to that madwoman's wildfire. By the gods, you gave me such a fright. You should have seen me. So angry I nearly burned King's Landing myself." Marjorie let out a shaky laugh. "I'm alive, thanks to luck or the gods. Loras is here too, though he was badly burned." She gestured to where Loras stood, and Olenna pressed her lips tight, seeing her beloved grandson so scarred. She went to him, clasping his hand, a tremor of sorrow in her eyes. They moved inside, where Olenna wasted no time in proclaiming that Dorne was prepared to ally with House Tyrell to overthrow Cersei. Ilaria Sand added that the Dornish wanted vengeance for Princess Elia, Oberyn Martell, and all the tragedies House Lannister had inflicted upon their people. Marjorie was cautious. She knew the Sand Snakes were cunning and ruthless, but she also saw that they shared a common enemy. For the moment, that was enough. In the Solar, Olenna explained that there were rumors of Daenerys Targaryen landing on Dragonstone. She intended to send a raven to invite Daenerys to ally with the Reach and Dorne. The Targaryen queen hates the Lannisters as well, Olenna said with a sharp glint in her eye. Between her dragons, Dorne's spears, and the roses of Highgarden, Cersei will be crushed like a cockroach underfoot. She cast a sidelong glance at Marjorie. And you, my dear, what are your intentions afterward? Will you claim the Iron Throne yourself? Or will you bend to Daenerys if she demands it? Marjorie paused, feeling the weight of the question. I want Cersei's tyranny ended. As for the throne, it belongs rightfully to someone of Targaryen blood, if we follow the old lines of succession. I was queen consort to Tommen, but that is in the past. The realm needs stability. I am prepared to support Daenerys if she proves worthy, but I will not allow the Reach to be trampled. Elaria Sand smiled, though it was a hard smile. We shall see if the Dragon Queen is more merciful than the Lannisters were. We must move carefully. Olenna nodded in approval. Good. This is the alliance we need. Dorne and the Reach together, and hopefully with Targaryen might as well. We will soon have the power to tear that lion woman off the throne. Marjorie felt a mix of relief and renewed determination. The Grand Alliance was taking shape. She would fight for the memory of her father, for the sake of her brother, for all who had been wronged by Cersei's cruelty. And if, in the end, it meant she herself ascended to rule, she would accept that burden with grace. She understood more than ever that power was as dangerous as wildfire, and only with caution and a righteous cause could she hope to wield it without being consumed. Days turned into weeks as Highgarden prepared for war. Dornish riders arrived, forging plans for a joint offensive. Letters were sent to Dragonstone, appealing to Daenerys. House Tarly mustered its levies. Marjorie traveled to Horn Hill personally to inspect the troops, impressing the soldiers with her fortitude and quiet resolve. Alongside her rode Loras, who refused to remain idle in Highgarden, even if he could not fight as before. As the host of the Reach gathered, Marjorie stood on a battlement overlooking the Mander. Tents sprawled across the fields, thousands of men arrayed under the Golden Rose, the Huntsman of Tarly, and other banners. The sun dipped low, casting the scene in a fiery glow. She felt a tremor in her heart, knowing that battles awaited them. Many of these men would not return home to their families if war broke out in earnest. She prayed she could lead them wisely, with as little bloodshed as possible, though she recognized the futility of hoping for a gentle war. Then the news came. Cersei's forces were on the move, marching south from the Crownlands, aiming perhaps to strike at Highgarden directly. Marjorie convened a war council with Olenna, Elaria, Lord Tarly, and the assembled lords. They debated strategy, eventually deciding to meet the Lannister host near the Rose Road, where the terrain favored the defenders from the Reach. Dorne would send a separate force, threatening the Stormlands to draw any crown reinforcements away. It was a bold plan, reliant on coordination and timing. The day arrived. Marjorie found herself seated on a palfrey at the crest of a hill, clad in boiled leather armor over her green gown, the golden rose of House Tyrell emblazoned across her chest. Loras stood beside her, wearing lighter armor, his face partially concealed by a visor. Olenna was further back, commanding from a vantage point with the senior knights. Lord Tarly and Devron formed the front lines. In the distance, dust clouds rose, betraying the approach of Cersei's army under the Lannister banners. The moment of reckoning drew near. Marjorie's pulse pounded. She recalled the day she escaped the wildfire. It was as if she had been reborn in the ashes, forged into something harder, more resolute. She thought of Cersei enthroned in King's Landing, imagining how smug and secure she must feel. Marjorie would shatter that smugness, show the realm that the Tyrell Rose was not so easily crushed. Horns sounded across the fields. The Lannister vanguard appeared, scarlet banners flying. Marjorie clenched her reins, glancing at Loras. He offered her a faint nod, unspoken words passing between them. This was for their father, for their family, for the realm. She lifted her hand in signal. The Tyrell archers loosed their arrows, a storm of feathers slicing the sky. The Lannisters halted, shields raised. Horns blared again. Men shouted, hoofs thundered. The clash of steel and the screams of war soon filled the air. She had never witnessed a full-scale battle before, nor had she desired to. Yet here she was at the center of it, the figurehead of House Tyrell's cause. She stayed near the rear lines, watched over by Devron's hand-picked guard. From that vantage, she saw the lines meet in a swirling melee. Sunlight glinted off helms and breastplates. In the swirling chaos, she glimpsed Tarly's standard, pressing forward. She spotted the Golden Rose flags pivoting, executing the battle plan they had painstakingly rehearsed. She heard the war cries, the trumpet blasts. She felt the ground tremble under the weight of thousands of men and horses. Her heart hammered painfully. She hated seeing men die, loathing the bloodshed. But she knew that if they did not fight now, Cersei would bring the fight to their gates. And so she held her head high, providing a rallying point for her troops. Whenever they glanced back and saw Marjorie Tyrell, the supposed dead queen very much alive, they fought with renewed vigor. The battle raged for hours, casualties mounting. At one point, a cry went up that the Lannisters had flanked the Tyrell left. Marjorie's stomach twisted. She watched a swirl of red infantry clash with Tyrell spearmen. But Tarly, from the center, directed reserves to close the gap. Slowly, the Lannister line began to falter under the weight of the Tyrell cavalry. The day was turning in their favor, though at terrible cost. As dusk approached, the Lannister forces broke, retreating in disarray. Horns sounded the pursuit, but Tarly ordered a measured advance rather than a reckless chase. He knew from experience that corners cut in pursuit could lead to ambush. Still, it was clear the Tyrells had won the field. The banner of the Golden Rose flew high. Marjorie exhaled a trembling breath. She felt no triumph, only relief that they had not been crushed. She descended the hill, riding carefully among the wounded and dying. Blood stained the grass. She heard groans, cries for mothers, curses against Lannisters or Tyrells. She wanted to do something, anything, to quell the suffering. But she was just one woman. Instead, she sent the maesters and field medics to help as many as possible, friend or foe. For a moment, she wished she were back in the days of being merely a charitable princess in King's Landing, handing out bread in the streets. War was uglier than she had ever imagined. Lord Tarly approached, covered in dust and spattered gore. We've pushed them back. Most of their cavalry escaped. We'll likely face them again. He bowed slightly in respect to Marjorie, though his tone was still brusque. You have your victory, your grace. Marjorie nodded wearily. At too high a cost. But thank you, Lord Tarly. We stand thanks to you and our men. He accepted her words with a curt nod, then went to oversee the next steps. Loras rode up, removing his helm. He, too, bore smears of blood on his armor, though she suspected most of it wasn't his own. His eyes shone with fierce pride mixed with sadness. We did it, he said softly. We stood against them. Marjorie forced a small smile. Yes, we did. But this is only the beginning. In the days that followed, word of the Tyrell victory spread across the Reach and beyond. The battered Lannister host retreated toward King's Landing, Cersei's hold on the south shaken. Allies of House Tyrell who had wavered now flocked to Marjorie's side. Dornish envoys confirmed their readiness to strike. Raven after raven arrived with messages of support, or pleas for help, or queries about alliances. Highgarden bustled with new energy, a mixture of hope and sorrow for the fallen. For Marjorie, each dawn was a chance to reflect on how far she'd come since the day of the September's destruction. She had gone from a frightened near victim of wildfire to a leader forging alliances, commanding armies, standing resolute against the Iron Throne. She knew she still faced challenges. Cersei was ruthless, and the war had only begun. Daenerys Targaryen was somewhere on the horizon, a powerful wild card. Yet Marjorie felt certain that, as long as she kept her wits sharp and her will unbroken, House Tyrell would not only survive, but flourish. One evening, she stood on a balcony overlooking the rose gardens. The setting sun lit the petals in a crimson glow. Loras joined her, moving stiffly. She slipped an arm around his shoulders, careful of his burns. Below them, she saw knights sparring, servants tending the gardens, children running about. Life went on even in the shadow of war. "Do you think we'll win?" Loras asked quietly. Marjorie's gaze swept the horizon. "We must," she said. "For Father's memory, for the people of the Reach, for all the innocents Cersei has harmed. We will bring her down. And if that means taking the throne ourselves, we shall until a just ruler can be established." She paused, a faint smile curving her lips. "Though part of me wonders if we might be that just rule the realm needs." Loras looked at her thoughtfully, then gave a small nod. "Perhaps we will be. We have each other and we have our people. Let Cersei scowl from the Red Keep. The Tyrell rose has thorns, and she knows it now." Marjorie closed her eyes, imagining the day she would confront Cersei face to face. She thought of the wildfire, the green glare, the screams. Her fists clenched involuntarily. She would not rest until justice was served. In the weeks and months to come, Marjorie Tyrell would lead the Reach in alliance with Dorne, coordinate with the Targaryens if their goals aligned, and continue to test her might against Cersei's. Some would call her the Widow Queen, others the Rose Queen. Many would rally to her, inspired by her near-miraculous survival. Others would fear her cunning, but all would recognize that she was no longer just a gracious court lady with a sweet smile. She was a survivor, shaped by fire, armed with a cause, determined to claim victory, and if fate demanded it, to claim the Iron Throne alone. And in the darkest hours of the night, when she dreamt of green flames devouring everything she loved, she would wake with a start, pressing a hand to her racing heart. Then she would remember that she was alive. She had endured the unthinkable and risen stronger. No matter what lay ahead, she was prepared. For she was Marjorie Tyrell, the last rose of Highgarden in King's Landing, the rightful widow of King Tommen, and the woman who would stop at nothing to see Cersei Lannister's reign ended. Perhaps one day to see that great metal seat in the Red Keep beneath her own hands. And so her story continued, an unbroken stem of resilience rooted in ambition, blossoming in the promise of vengeance. The future of Westeros was uncertain as ever, a tapestry of shifting loyalties and hidden dangers. But for now, Marjorie Tyrell stood in the heart of the Reach, her banner waving in the wind, proclaiming to all who beheld it that the rose had not withered in the wildfire. She lived